course, it is just wonderful. It's so wonderful to see you all here at our second event of the forum series of our forum series, Back to Campus Alumni Stories. So I will be reading Nune's official bio. So Nune holds a BA in English and Communications from the American University of Armenia and an MS in Development Management from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's an international development practitioner. Having lived and traveled in rural communities across Armenia and Spain, her projects have covered areas of rural development, innovation, social entrepreneurship, and education. Her most recent consultancy was on a novel spectrum of impact measurement, social return on investment, covering rural Equatorial Guinea. And I'm very happy to say that very recently, Nune also landed an internship at the World Food Program in Rome, so she will be going and coming very soon. So, and Nune, actually, that's what I was just hearing Gardis now say, that Nune is also, that he was saying that Nune was in the very first class you taught here, right, at the freshman seminar. And Nune was in the very first class I taught here as well, philosophy of education, perspectives in education. And it was very clear from the very first encounter that I had with Nune that she had a brilliant future in front of her. And Nune has, from that time I remember like our deep conversations together from then and afterwards as well, about her passions, her dual passions. One is youth and education and the other is development. And it is just so wonderful seeing how she went after her dreams for all these years, working in the youth and education sector here in Armenia, and then how she got her achievement scholarship to go and do her dream, actually, graduate studies in development management. And today's talk, Nune will focus on her research on catalysts of rural development and will bring us a multi-geographical perspective on it. And I'm also very happy to say that Nune will also is in the process of making sure that our own library also has a copy of her thesis. And I'm sure that it is going to engender a lot of conversations as well. Nune, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm blushing. Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to be back to my alma mater at the American University of Armenia. And I really hope that truly conversations like this will contribute to more and more discussions about what is rural development and what are the potentials of our rural communities across Armenia and in the world, obviously. So basically, my today's talk, I will cover my dissertation, so my individual research study, which was a comparison between Armenia and Bolivia, again, on a rural development topic. And I will also talk about my own consultancy project with a few other classmates that we did as part of my degree, and this covers rural Equatorial Guinea. So without further ado, this is my first part of the presentation. I'm going to talk about the connection between local governance and information and communication technologies for rural development initiatives. And I did a comparative case study between Armenia and Bolivia. And because local governance and information and communication technologies, rural development, these are all very big buzzwords, I decided that I should focus on agricultural initiatives enhanced through mobile phones as the type of ICT. So you will hear a lot me saying ICT. This is the information and communication technologies, just as a continuation of the presentation. Just for us to get an understanding how far these two countries really are. Bolivia is in South America and Armenia is obviously, we all know where it is, but very interestingly, those two countries really had so many similarities and so many challenges that they were facing, but also a lot of the difference that they could really learn from each other. And I deeply believe in development sphere, developing countries can learn so much more from each other than developing countries can learn from developed countries because they face a lot of the same challenges. In a nutshell, what is the research study about? Basically, as I said, I compared and contrasted two things. So I had the connection of two things. So I have the independent variable as the local governance. Independent variable in academia is basically, as we all know, it is something that is on its own, so it is not dependent on something, as the word says. And dependent variable, which is dependent on the independent variable, is the ICTs for rural development. So I'm trying to understand if that type of local governance is really having any sort of a role in ICTs for rural development initiatives in these two countries. And the two countries are actually contrasted with their type of local governance. One of the reasons why I chose these two countries is that Bolivia is actually a textbook example of decentralization. And Armenia is kind of on the side of trying to be more decentralized, but it is very still heavily centralized. Actually, basically, decentralization means that the local government members have a lot more authority about how their budget is spent, what type of projects they're doing in the community. And in a centralized way, the central government, in this case in Armenia from Yerevan, is telling somebody in Armavir that this is what you should be doing and this is the money that I'm giving you to be doing these types of initiatives. So there are a few debates within ICT for rural development as an area of study, which was very fascinating for me because I always thought that, of course, the more you have access to technology, the more advanced you are as a society. But there is this rural penalty per se that there is actually this difference between urban and rural areas. There is this huge disparity. So the debate is, should we continuously try to force everyone to be on the same page about having more and more technology in their everyday life? So for example, if no type of transaction can be made without having access to technologies, this means that these people have this rural penalty. So really they cannot participate in any of the processes that are going on. So the debate is that maybe this is actually contributing to this continuous widening gap between the urban areas of the developed countries and the rural areas in developing countries who are never going to reach the same level of access to technology. So why are we trying to push this towards them? And what should we do instead? Because we are on this track of having more and more technology involved in our everyday lives. There are many different types of debates within this field, and I actually chose, as you will see later on in the slides, what I actually chose is trying to actually put the people's needs first rather than what the state needs per se. In terms of what is ICTs for agriculture, since I mentioned that the activities are going to be about rural activities, rural development initiatives are going to be focused on agriculture. There are two types of technology for agriculture fields. One is obviously agrotech, which is technology that is helping more farmers to do more productive farming practices. But what we are going to speak about is the information and communication technology. So, for example, mobile phones, how do they help them? Let's say they give them information about the weather so that they can do more disaster risk mitigation and so on and so forth. As I mentioned, this is basically put in a graph, what is my scope of research. If I hover this over, I think you can see, right? Yeah. So local governance, this is the independent variable. It is actually influencing the dependent variable, ICTs for rural development. In local governance, so we have Bolivia, which is decentralized, and Armenia, which is centralized in its type of local governance. And so for ICTs for rural development, as I mentioned, I'm focusing on agriculture as a field and mobile phones as a type of technology. That's why the arrows are pointing up. And the arrows are pointing down here from agriculture and economic welfare and individual welfare, which brings me to my next point about how exactly are we trying to measure what is development and is this developing with our own measurements. Let me speak a little bit about this theoretical framework and the methodology. So if we go back here, as I mentioned, economic welfare and individual welfare. So for economic welfare, usually we have measurement as a GDP, gross domestic product. GDP of a country, GDP per capita. So for GDP per capita is how much money is allocated per citizen per se, based on the GDP of the country. But the capabilities approach, which was actually developed by Amartya Sen, he's the main spokesperson about this approach, and he actually won a Nobel Prize about this for economics welfare. So in capabilities approach, basically, individual well-being is the measurement of impact. So outside of GDP, there is so much more that we have to take into account, as in to understand, are the people actually happy in this country that actually has a lot of money per se? And the capabilities approach is actually one of the cornerstones of ICT for development as a field. ICT impact chain is actually developed from this capabilities approach. Here it actually shows, and it is developed by Soren Gigler, and it is talking about what are the involved parties, who are the people, what is the local culture, is there any sort of trust towards the local intermediary organizations. So why I actually wanted to mention this was because the rural and urban disparity is one of the reasons why a lot of the projects don't actually work, is because there is not a lot of trust from the people toward the people who are coming from outside and telling them this is what you should be doing. But instead, if there are local people involved in this process, even if it's a collaboration, let's say, between somebody who is coming, let's say, from Yerevan and somebody who is a local activist or a local municipality member, this is a lot more easy to manage, and actually there is a lot more productivity on both sides. My apologies. So as I mentioned, this is a comparative case analysis. I did a secondary data based comparative case study. I unfortunately didn't go to both of the countries. This stopped.
I just slightly reduced it, so it's
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
But I don't think it.
It's working.
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is. Perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, this is so much better. And the both of the countries are actually kind of a non-traditional choice, but and as you could imagine, there is no literature about them. There is only one type of paper that I found as a comparison between CIS countries and the South American or Latin American countries. But what actually I wanted to do, obviously I wanted to contribute to a literature about Armenia, but I didn't want to have a comparison on countries that are, let's say, Armenia and Georgia, or, there's this type of more traditional type of comparison, Armenia with another CIS country. But so I had to look into a few different aspects. I wanted to have two types of comparisons. First, on the actual local governance type. So as I mentioned, both countries, one is decentralized, one is centralized, but also both are landlocked. And one of the main helps and the catalyst for landlocked countries is technology, just because they don't have access to the sea. So in a lot of the economic activities, they are not really a part of. And Bolivia also had a similar issue with Armenia in terms of mining as a lower productivity added, lower value added activity. And basically lower and higher value added activities in a nutshell is that a lower value added activity is not making the country as competitive as a higher value added product. So if a higher added value product can be having producing laptops and exporting it all over the world. So it makes the country a lot more competitive than, for example, mining inside it, and not really having a comparative advantage with other countries. The theoretical framework was basically at first to understand and evaluate who are the people and what are the types of needed ICTs for agricultural practices. And this was adopted from the ICT impact chain model. The second part was actually having access to technology mediated through local intermediaries. In this case, it is the local governance. And the application of ICTs for agricultural practices, so how they are applying it. There are two types of ways that they could be applying. One could be somebody coming and telling them this is what you could be doing so that you are more productive in your agricultural practice. And another way is that it is which is more actually prevalent in Bolivia, a more participatory approach, so that somebody is coming and telling them, here we want to do something, but let's do it together. So let's first understand what do you want to do and what we are bringing from outside. The fourth part is meaningful use of ICTs for tangible outcomes. So how are they actually using it? So let's say if they're given mobile phones, are they just using it for weather as it was intended, or in so many studies I would read that outside of it there is also this emotional appeal that you're actually calling and talking to another farmer and asking, here are the challenges that I'm facing, what do you think about this, have you dealt with a similar problem, and so on and so forth. So this was actually outside of what was intended, and this was a nice bonus, let's say. At the end, you have increased informational capabilities. So basically, this is contributing to individual welfare. They are more aware about how to use technology. They have increased human capabilities, but they also have increased social capabilities, just because in rural areas the sense of community is so much stronger than in an urban area. And that is what the capabilities approach wants you to do, to understand, is this actually making people happy outside of reporting that this much money was raised, or this much it contributed to the GDP, and so on. So going to the actual analysis, there are two ways. So first I will talk about Bolivia, and the second part will be about Armenia, obviously. So as I mentioned, Bolivia is very decentralized. And actually one of the reasons Bolivia is so decentralized is because the actual name of the country in itself, it says the plurinational state of Bolivia. In Armenia, we are more or less used to having mostly Armenians around us, but in Bolivia, they actually have very big diversity of ethnic groups, and all of them are really facing different types of challenges. So for them, they actually go rotationally. So every time in the central government, the authorities are actually changing due to the ethnic groups that they're representing. So everyone is represented more or less. And another thing outside of being highly decentralized due to their ethnic diversity is because they are geographically diverse. So they have lowlands, highlands, the Andes, the Amazons. So everywhere they have very different types of stories, so very different types of challenges. So I was reading a lot of these reports, which was so different for me as an Armenian, that they would say in, let's say, the highlands, there are so many communities that they don't have access to internet. They also don't have access to a mobile broadband connection. So using internet through mobile or calling, because they are living in the highlands and they actually needed a lot more advanced technology using satellites or something to help them. The government is trying to take care of it, but it is still a very big issue. So in this sense, it is actually good, I think, personally, that they have a more decentralized governance. And the way that they did it is basically overnight. One day they decided that we're going to become decentralized, and they did, and they are still trying to embed it into the state building. The role of the ICTs in the lives of farmers, there are many studies that were done. Obviously, just wanted to point out as a more or less a limitation of this study was that all of my sources were in English, and obviously in Bolivia they are Spanish speaking, and there would be a lot more information that I would have access to had I spoken fluent Spanish. I wish, but I don't. So, for example, one of the case studies that I wanted to point out here is one of the Cochabamba region in the Andes. Basically, what they did was they did this case study with potato farmers. So they gave them mobile phones and they said, use it as much as you want and however you want. And most of the time, these farmers became a lot more proficient about how to use their harvest in a smarter way, so they could actually make more money. What usually happens a lot of times is that the farmers, somebody as a middleman, they call them and they say, this is how much it is in Santa Cruz, which is one of the biggest markets that they can go and give their harvest to. And they don't know if this is true or not. So the middleman could be lying, and the middleman could have been trying to make profit off of this. So what happens is when you give mobile phones, and when they are actually connected with this mobile phone, they can talk to other people and they can say, you know what, this is wrong. You told me that this is the price in the market, but it isn't. So they are able to negotiate it a lot easier. Outside of it, they also can check the weather, or they can be given short messages and SMSs from the donor that please look out for this type of disaster for your harvest. So they actually do have a lot more productivity in this sense. There's also a national agricultural agency that is provided from the central government, but it is very interesting how it is serving the needs of local communities, because the national agency is actually talking to the local communities through the local government members. So they're asking them, they're reaching out to the local government members and they're asking them what are their needs and how they can help them as a research agricultural agency. So each of the research that is done is very customized to the needs of that specific region. I'm not sure if it is per community because it is a lot of work, but at least per region, depending on whatever challenges they are facing. And in terms of the contrast towards Armenia, there is a lot more widespread access to mobile broadband connection, even if in rural communities people are not owning any type of, let's say, laptop or some other type of technology. Mobile phones are usually the technology that they own, at least one per family. Obviously, this is not the story for everyone, but at least it is a lot more widespread access than in Bolivia. There is an Armenia's digitalization strategy, which I really wanted to point this out here because when I read more about this digitalization strategy, it really mentioned how much how much potential Armenia has, because IT is so big here. But IT is big in the capital. IT is not big in rural communities. So a lot of times this IT boom is not really serving the vulnerable people. And unfortunately, the e-agriculture that they are trying to implement, a lot of the times the local government members and the central government members, they are having disagreements on how they should push forward on this and how they should implement it. And it is actually slowing down the process a lot. This is most of the findings that I had from the research that I did, but I wanted to also add a personal note to this, that outside of the disagreements that there could be between those two sides, it is also just to try to understand what is the economic situation and are the people really ready to have this digitalization strategy. And going back to the capabilities approach about looking at things outside of the GDP, it is the individual welfare, and I genuinely believe that there should be a lot more conversations with the local people and trying to understand socio-anthropologically, are they really ready to move forward on this advancement. So the regions actually, as I mentioned, because it is a more or less centralized government, is as much as there is more and more initiatives that are trying to push for more decentralization in the local communities and local decision making. There is still most of the, I think more than 80% of the budget that is coming is from the central government, and obviously it comes with a certain type of agenda. So they need to be able to follow this agenda. And there is one case study that is very similar to the Bolivian case study that I mentioned about potato harvesting, the Digital Vision Small Grant Program, which was done by Oxfam. Again, similarly, people were given access to mobile technology, and it definitely had a lot more positive influence in their farming practices. But the two things that I wanted to mention more about this case study is first the role of women, because there was a certain amount of budget that was allocated to trying to have more and more women be as beneficiaries, so more and more women were getting mobile phones. And very interestingly enough, and not surprisingly enough, women were getting a lot more independence from their male partners once they had more access to information, and also had more or less financial freedom, just because they could actually talk to each other and make decisions together as part of the community. And another thing that I wanted to mention here is that the people were actually more or less exposed to technology, so I'm not quite sure how much it supported them, even though it really looks good on paper. I, as an academic and as a development practitioner, I would definitely question it, because I don't know if there was any sort of a study that was done before this and how much it actually supported them. So just to sum up, in decentralized governance, the national government has a lot more authority, so they make a lot more decisions, and the solutions are more tailored to the well-being of the local communities, decided by them, the local communities. And in centralized government, the local authorities have very limited role. So their role is basically simply excluded from the implementation of ICTs in the rural communities. Actually, going back to this case study, basically anywhere in the report, I could not find one sentence that said the local government did this, which is so interesting because it was done in a rural community, but there was no mention. I'm sure there was some type of conversations, but they mostly mentioned the local activists, the rural activists. I'm not quite sure what exactly was the role of the central government here. And as you could already see, even though the types of local governance were different, the outcomes were not that different from each other. And frankly, I don't know why it is, but I think it really gives a lot more perspective to try to understand more implications of this. So just to mention what is the relevance of this study, I think that as a young and independent country, it is something that we should consider as a part of a state building. We genuinely, I think a lot of the times, as much as I read and as much as I try to infer, maybe the local government does not actually know what is its defined role in these types of initiatives. And I don't necessarily know what is going on inside, just because I only did a secondary data analysis. And I would love to hear more if anyone has more insights about this and if they have worked about it. But I definitely think that they should be more highlighted, what the local government members should be doing, what is their role. And there is a cross-border analysis here, because both of these countries are landlocked. Both of them are having very similar issues with, as I said, mining and not being that competitive in their economies, and how they are actually turning to technologies for economic growth, so they can really learn from each other. And there is this also the hidden catalyst, as I put here. There is a lot more socio-anthropological implications, in my opinion, that should be taken into account here, outside of just telling how it helped to the GDP, because as we all know, GDP is more or less the main measure of welfare for citizens. Okay, moving on. Just bear with me in this sense because I know that there was a lot of information that I had, but I also really wanted to highlight the consultancy project that I did as the unintended effects of sustainable agricultural practices in Equatorial Guinea. And I really believe that the two are really interconnected with each other. So having all the information in mind from the comparative case study I did individually, I just wanted to mention that this was a group project, so I was responsible for certain aspects of it, and some of my classmates were responsible for other parts. But as part of my degree, we actually did work on a live consultancy project. So just pointing out where is Equatorial Guinea. I also had to look it up. I knew it was in Africa, but I didn't necessarily. I never had the opportunity to read more about it, and now I know it is right above the equator, just as expected, just because it is called Equatorial Guinea. So what is the project scope? We try to assess the impact of increased income of farmers on the investment or the disinvestment in their children's education in Equatorial Guinea. This sounds like a lot of buzzwords. I will break it down. Basically, we try to understand if the project, the agricultural project that was given in this community, is this agricultural project helping the farmers get more money? And if it is it helping them invest more in their children's educational outcomes? And so we use evaluative social return on investment as a tool for impact measurement. So this is the case study. Our client was Montrose International. It is a development consultancy that works in education, health, and other sectors, as you can see. The name of the project is called ProEmpresa. So ProEmpresa was a project that we tried to measure, basically. What it is that it enhances the income and the well-being of farmers. I'll give you an example, and this really stuck with me when we spoke with our client. What really happens in Equatorial Guinea is, you can see the pineapple here. There is a very big production of pineapples. So people are harvesting pineapples 2 times a year or 3 times a year. What is happening is that when they're trying to harvest the pineapples 2 or 3 times a year, they don't have sustainable income. So consistently, they are in a cycle of poverty. They're in a cycle of debt. So once they receive some type of money from their harvest from pineapple, they give their debt to the people that took the debt from, and they sit and they don't have any more money. So then, because they need money, they need to feed their children, they take more debt, they take more loans. And again, second time the harvest comes, again, they need to give the money to cover the debt or to cover the loan, and so on and so forth. So you can continuously see that there is no space, no room for them to grow outside of this poverty trap. What this project is trying to do, and has done quite successfully, is that they did some different types of workshops with the farmers, and they tried to teach them how can you get pineapple harvest all year long, not just 2 times a year or 3 times a year, not in the season. So they tried to help the farming practices so that they could become a lot more sustainable in that sense. And this is a project that was run from 2015 to 2023. And what we try to do is, when you have this type of a project and when you're trying to understand if this is helping the farmers, if they're getting more income with this project, are there any type of side effects? So what we try to understand is, if these farmers have more money now, are they sending their children to school more than before? Because they have more money, that means their children will eat better, their children will go to school. So this would be the side effect, more or less. What social return on investment in itself does, and I will refer to it as SROI, social return on investment is an outcomes-based measurement framework. So they're trying to thing, and in the next slides you will see how the whole process works. They're trying to measure what the outcomes of the projects are. Usually it is quantitative, so you're trying to quantify the social impact, the environmental impact, the economic value that the organization is creating, or even destroying. A lot of the times, one project is actually hampering another project and it's not really working well. So it attaches a monetary value to whatever value is being created or destroyed by the organization. And there are two types. There is forecast, social return on investment, evaluation, and evaluative. Forecast is when you are actually doing a forecast what you would think would happen, what you will think you will find out. And then at the end of the project, you do an evaluative social return on investment. So you are trying to evaluate what you found out. Just to put it in 5 different stages, how SRI works. At first, we identify who the stakeholders are. So bringing back to our case, the stakeholders are the farmers, the stakeholders are the rural communities. When we are trying to map the outcome, in this case it is the educational outcome, so are children going to school more because of this? And just as a side note, in Equatorial Guinea, a lot of the times students go to school a lot more years than 12 years, just because they're in and out of school. So a lot of times they will go to their parents to help in the field, and they will drop out for a year, and then they will come back again. So we had a lot of cases in our surveys that we had people go to school for 17 years, 20 years, just because there is a big gap years that they're continuously taking. So, or they are at school, but they're failing because they're not going to school and they're helping their parents. The third stage is evidencing and valuing the outcomes. So we're trying to understand the monetary value that we're gaining and how many years of education we're gaining. As a side note, as a side effect of this project. So we're assessing the impact once we have the information through the evidencing stage. So as our evidence, we did a survey with the farmers, and then we assessed the impact that they were making. And at the end, we have the calculation, obviously. So you put, for SRI, we used something called regression analysis. Basically, in regression analysis, once you have the quantifiable data you put it on the software and it makes the calculations for you, and you have formulas that you follow. Basically, it is a very standardized process, and it is something that is trying to attract more and more corporate sector donors or non-profit sector trying to actually measure what type of impact they are making as part of their projects. When we're trying to map the outcomes, as I mentioned before, coming back to this slide, the input here is the resources for growing pineapples and the trainings that they're going through. As I mentioned, the company comes, as in mantras, they come and they tell you, here we're going to help you through these trainings to become more sustainable and more effective in your practices. The output are the number of trainings that were conducted and the improved farming practices that they were having. So the direct outcomes, obviously, as I mentioned, they have more income. Obviously, more income leads to a better quality of life, but the long-term indirect outcome, which of course is a non-exclusive list, we mentioned the improved health, for example, for household members. So if they are sick, they can actually go to the doctor because they have the money to do it. A lot of times they don't. So the second part is access to food or electricity. So if they have money, they can pay the utilities. If they have money, their children can eat better. They have access to clean water. A lot of times they don't. So also access to credit and formal financial institutions. As I mentioned, a lot of times these farmers are in debt because they don't have access to financial institutions because they don't have any sort of history. So coming, for example, to my example, if I go to a bank, I can actually request some kind of a loan because I have a history with them, right? But if I don't have any sort of history ever of having a credit card, it is a lot more difficult to do this. So a lot of the times these farmers didn't have access to formal financial institutions. So if they're trying to take a loan or a debt from somebody, let's say their relative or this person who gives informal loans, let's say they will have 50% interest rate on this. And this person doesn't have any other choice. They have to take it because they can't go to a bank. So it really contributes to the poverty trap that they're still stuck in the cycle. So what we try to understand is, are they educating their biological children and children under their care? And that's what we did as a quantifiable result. And just as a side note, the biological children and children under care, this is very common, especially in this in the region that Equatorial Guinea is in Central Africa. Basically, a lot of times when somebody doesn't have enough money, they will give one of their children to their siblings or a cousin who actually is more financially viable to take care of the children. So if they can't afford feeding their children, they will give up one or two of them, and somebody will say, I have 5 biological children and 4 non-biological children, and that's what it means. So we try to evidence and value the outcomes through a survey. As I mentioned, 21% of the farmers were surveyed, and 404 biological and non-biological children were assessed. What we found out after removing the dead weight, I will come back to what they did means. We had 1.16 years per child. That meant that through this project, that the farmers were getting more money. They were able to send their children 1 year, 1.16 years more than they could before. And for every dollar that was spent by our client, $4.42 was gained in educational attainment. So what it means when you gain educational attainment is that these people will actually become more high-performing citizens per se when they grow up and they go to work. They can actually bring a lot more taxes to the government, right? And they will be a lot more high-performing. And if it is so, then our client who is investing X amount of money will gain a lot more out of it than whatever they're giving. And to just come back to dead weight means that if the program was there or was not there, regardless, they will send their children to school. So with dead weight, we had more than 3 years, but when you remove it, you actually have the net, basically, how much was actually left for them to send, for their children to be sent to school. And I really think that this is very technical, and especially for me, I think that they really needed stories to be attached to them. So what is the country context? What is the literature saying about this? What I did was, most of my part in this project was to actually make this happen. So try to actually bring stories to try to attach to whatever number we were getting. Basically, Equatorial Guinea is a very oil-heavy economy. Very recently, a few years ago, it was discovered that they have a lot of oil. So many developed countries, unfortunately, they came in and the GDP grew really high. So one thing that I didn't actually know, and I found out about this through research, is when a country moves from lower middle income to, let's say, higher middle income, and this is exactly what happened with Equatorial Guinea. So basically, some kind of donor, some kind of government, they came and they said, we like the fact that you have oil, let's do mining, so let's actually employ people who are the local citizens to actually do the mining work. And obviously these people would get paid very little to do mining work, but the rich would actually get richer because they would extract the resource. But what would happen is that there would be so much more circulation in the economy of that money that the country would say that, wow, we are performing so well because we have this new resource and it is getting so much more investment. But the actual people were not really getting much out of it. But what happens is that, especially through the World Bank, if you qualify for some kind of a loan, if your country is now moving from lower middle income to higher middle income, then you are not really qualified for certain types of loans anymore, which means that again, the citizens are the ones who are being affected by this. So there is very limited presence of foreign aid agencies, there is very limited presence of international development organization, because there is a very high corruption happening. And as I mentioned, children, a lot of times they don't finish school at all, or they finish a lot more than in 12 years. And the project beneficiaries, who are the people who don't really have that much income outside of pineapple harvesting, they have to take care of even more children than their biological ones. And the relevance of this project that I really wanted to bring out, connecting to our own context in Armenia, we try to really think, and it really made me think, what are the implications of investing in agriculture that goes beyond income increase scope. So in this case, we saw that more children go to school, more children are eating better, and if they're eating better, that means that they will grow up better, healthier, and they will become more high-performing citizens of the country. So I guess coming back to our own country, in our own context, what does this mean for us? What are the type of projects that are happening, and what are the implications? And today's direct and indirect beneficiaries can become tomorrow's very big citizens, high-performing citizens. And there's also the type of flexibility that I think really applies to a lot of the organizations that are working on these types of initiatives, be it in rural areas, be it in agriculture or not. Because if you really think about it, whatever project that is happening as a development project, there are so many quote-unquote side effects that are happening that we should really try to take into account. And when we're working with the donors, or when we're working with sponsors, we should try to understand how we are telling them our story, outside of the fact that people will get more money, will get more income. What does this mean for them, for their children, for their children's future? So I really invite you to reflect on these questions, and I hope we will do so as part of the Q&A. I want us all to think about, who do these projects really serve and their results. Who do they serve? What type of socio-anthropological implications do we have in measuring individual and communal welfare through these types of initiatives? And could we, or should we, classify these types of positive numerical quantitative results as quote-unquote development done right? And with that, I wanted to say thank you. I'll just leave the slide here.
Yes, because it's important for us to reflect on those questions together. So we do have a portable mic as well, and for questions, and the floor is open to questions. To Nune on her work. Oh.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting information. And there was a lot that I was also learning for myself, even though I've been in development work a lot, doing a lot of international work. I want to, as I was listening to this, one of the things that I was thinking to myself is that understanding the difficulties and the hardships, and at the same time, parents or the society, the community, really valuing education. They do want to say, especially in the case of the Ecuadorian Guinea, sending their kids to school. Well, first of all, I assume this is the academic, this is the secondary school type of setting that they're sending to. Did you come across any information about valuing or having opportunities to also send kids to non-academic, non-formal education type? And obviously that would be a very different setting perhaps than from what we have here. But still, I mean, the notion itself of out-of-school activity. And then, as being in adult education a lot nowadays, I also want to ask, did you come across any examples or anything about the adults or the parents also being interested? Do they have opportunities? What kind of opportunity would they have? Who are the teachers? You know, this is broad. This is really to reflect more on the context. Thank you. So this is all.
Thank you so much. So I'll go first in terms of the study level that we were focusing on. Actually, a lot of the times people didn't really finish elementary school. So we were looking more into elementary and secondary. In terms of higher education, it is very low percentage, so we didn't even touch upon that. There is the vocational training that is an alternative to, let's say, outside of school activities, but this was more done by adults rather than children. But one thing that I wanted to point out was when we were developing the survey to send out to the staff to do it locally in the community, we try to use these big words and we try to come up with very fancy questions, and they said we will have to actually translate or tell this in a very I don't want to say elementary, simple way to the farmers, because many of them, all they do is they try to do farming practices, so some of them can't really read and write that well. So I'm not quite sure how much there would be interest towards more practices outside of these trainings, but definitely these trainings were something that a lot of them participated for the first time outside of their usual farming practices that they used to do. And I'm really hoping that I will have more hopeful results in a few years. But yeah, this was one of the very few projects that was done in the country, and they used the results that we had as the monetary evaluation and the monetary gain that the client had to actually convince the government that this is a good investment. So if you could let us, we could prolong the initiative and we could have more beneficiary farmers.
Thank you very much. Nuna, this is great work you've done. I hope you enjoyed the process as well. Going back to the Bolivia-Armenia case, what interests me, of course, is how information moves and how information is adopted and how it changes behavior. We do a lot of work with communities around the country. That insight that you had, that it's very important to have local agents be part of that information transfer process, peer-to-peer, more than top-down. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, often in development projects that's missed. And farmers and rural, rural people living in rural communities, they often would even dismiss anyone coming and trying to lecture them on something. Often, you're just like discounting, right? Because you don't know their reality, you don't understand them. So peer-to-peer is very valuable. Now this IT intervention, use of IT on all of this, it's also, I think there's some specifications of how it can become more effective than it is. So what did you learn about that aspect of how to use IT more effectively to make sure? And in the context of, I think, looking at centralized versus non-centralized, of course the level of development between Bolivia and Armenia is radically different, right? I mean, Armenia has benefited from 7 years of Soviet investment and social development and all that, and then, of course, we've fallen back a little bit, but I think is just not very low comparison. I mean, the level of poverty you see in Bolivia is just severely disturbing, right? So I think in the context of Armenia, local governments, part of the reason they may not be, because the institution isn't very well developed yet. And people don't trust the local politicians. And they would often rather circumvent them than go through the local government. Right? So there's also that nuance, and I don't know if you addressed that in your research or came across any analysis.
So the first part was how the technology could be used in a more productive way. As I mentioned, I really wish that I had more primary data access, and this was more through a secondary data analysis. One thing that, going back to the impact chain that I have basically adapted from the model, going back to that study done in rural Bolivia, a lot of the times that the technology they were mentioning is empowering, let's say, local women to learn how to use computers, to research how to do more efficient farming practices, so to have more access to the information. So I'm not sure the type of technology that they would be using more, because I'm guessing it is more computers and mobile phones, and outside of it not really that much diversity in how much access they have, given how much access they have to technology and broadband connection. So I think that most of the time, this is what I read, that they kind of start with local activists or local NGO that is training, let's say in Bolivia, how to use a computer for research purposes. And I think it is a very hands-on and step-by-step process that there's always somebody with them. And the difference that I read is most of the time in these rural communities in Bolivia, there is somebody who has been running this NGO for years in the community, and people really trust her or him to do these trainings with them, as you mentioned already. So that is mostly what I came across, and whatever is coming from the central government. So when they have this agriculture research agencies or whoever is helping them, it is basically the mediated by the local government. And if, for example, they need some type of, let's say, technology access, it is given from the central government to them based on the customized need that they have. I guess I don't have more content related insights in terms of more effective use on technologies, but yeah, that was mainly it. And in Armenia's case, I think just because, as you mentioned, there is a very drastic difference about how people use these types of technologies. I guess Armenia is basically a step forward, more or less, that people don't really want them to tell how to use mobile phones or whatever technology that they're given, and they will instead choose to do it. But for example, in the Oxfam case, they worked with the meteor. I'm trying to remember the English word for the meteorological institute here, so they could send them SMSs about the potential disasters or what is the weather and how this could affect their harvest. So this is, hail is coming up, this is what you could be doing. So they actually partnered together for this. In terms of the second part about having people tell them what to do, I think I saw this a lot in both countries, that in Armenia, I think there is this lack of trust towards both the central government and local government. But I genuinely think that if the local government knew what their mandate is, they maybe would have engaged maybe even more with the citizens, because in Oxfam's case, in the case study, they didn't mention anything. How did they work with the municipality? What did the municipality do? So I think a lot of times the municipality, even in itself, they think, okay, what do we do here? How do we help you? as an outsider. And I do wish that Armenia could learn a bit more from Bolivia, because Bolivia had a very straightforward agency for the local government and how they can support the local government. Thank you.
I was thinking about what seem to be like two big kind of differences between the two countries. Besides the centralized and decentralized that you mentioned. And one, I mean, I guess is just size, right? That Bolivia is so much larger. It doesn't really look like it on the map, but when I don't know how many Armenias you could fit in Bolivia, but I think it's a lot. I think it's like 20 or something. I guess part of what I was wondering is like how much that makes a difference to some of these kinds of questions, especially the kind of question of centralized versus decentralized, when people from Yerevan, if they wanted to, could make site visits to anywhere in Armenia in a day, right? You just drive there, and it might be an annoying drive, but you can still get there in a day. And then my other question is, you talked about the ethnic diversity, and I was wondering if in Bolivia that also meant linguistic diversity. Like I was wondering if there were some communities where Spanish was at very least not their first language, and maybe not even the language that some members of the community spoke really that well, and kind of what that meant for all those kinds of issues with information. Because I would imagine that say the brokers in Santa Cruz were speaking Spanish and not whatever indigenous language they were speaking in the village in the mountains, and just like those kinds of differences, which seems quite different than the situation in Armenia. So I was wondering if you could talk us through that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So first part about the country sizes, and the second part more about the linguistic diversity. Yeah. In terms of the country sizes, I definitely agree. And what really struck the most for me is when you look at a country size like Bolivia, decisions were made very easily when they decided to do decentralization. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons was because when they did decentralization, they said, you have the agency and you make decisions. Of course, a lot of times it comes with challenges, and they are also, a developing country, so obviously they have their own issues and they have their own local disagreements. But I definitely think that for a country like Armenia, things could have worked so much easier. But I think this anthropological implication here is that people really don't like to be told what to do. And if somebody is coming from the outside, they already have this preconceived notion, who is this? And I think more and more organizations are taking the use out of this and involving the local active community members to facilitate these types of discussions. So I thought that, of course, if you compare the country sizes in Armenia, things would have just worked so much easier, but they don't, mostly because of these types of human nature and how it is in the Caucasus. And there's, I read so many articles and so many white papers about how decentralization that was more pushed for Armenia was not really taking place, just because the central government will tell the local government, this is what you should do, and they say no. So there is also this personal disagreements between the local communities and the central government. So even for a country size Armenia, the decisions were not really made that easily, and they could have, but I don't think it's a certain disadvantage or an advantage per se. It's just a reality that we should deal with, and we should try to understand how to move forward from it. And in terms of the linguistic differences, even a lot of people in Bolivia, they didn't speak Spanish, so they spoke their local indigenous language. So even, for example, the computer trainings that I was talking about earlier, this was done with Aymara women, so the ethnic group, a certain ethnic group in Bolivia, and it was all done in the local language. So they translated the materials from Spanish to the local language so that the local NGO could do the trainings with them, with the women. And I think that it really is respectable towards the people and what they need, and I think Armenia could really learn a lot out of this with our Yazidi communities, with our Assyrian communities, and don't necessarily think that they have to, assimilate linguistically. If we could have accommodations with them, for them, I think it could actually help the integration as well in that sense. So I hope it covers some of the
Yeah,
questions.
Any other questions?
I might have a
Yes.
related Nana, do you have any information about what are some of the barriers that Armenian government is facing towards taking this decentralized approach?
So there is the Council of Europe, not the Council of Europe, there's Council of Europe that is working on decentralization. So there is this Council of Europe authorities for local government, and they actually have yearly sessions in the headquarters. So some of the local government members are going there and exchanging about their practices. I definitely think that there is this thing in our academic literature that I think is very relevant. It's called path dependence. So if a country has chosen a certain path, so let's say Armenia has chosen IT to be one of its big pillars for economy boosting, then it should just keep going. Because if you go back and you pursue something else, it will be more costly. So I think it is kind of this type of path dependence with decentralized and centralized government that things have just really been working more or less. So why change it? So if they have been doing this centrally and things have been working okay, then there comes a resistance with it. And I don't necessarily know, and now that I think about it, that even if the local government members had some kind of disagreements with the central government, do they really want to become very independent in their decision making? I'm not sure, because I don't know if they are really 100% set on what is their mandate. So I'm not really also sure if people do want to have more independence in their decision making, and that is also something that somebody else could take upon, and maybe through conversations and focus groups would gain more insights. Thank you.
Actually, I have a question.
Yes.
You know what my question is, because we've talked about it quite a bit. I know that you talked, like in the first part, you were talking about the role of women, especially when you were looking at Armenia, and how they felt empowered, and how even like that kind of the independence of income, etc. I was very curious whether you had any kind of a gender perspective or analysis with the SRLI in Equatorial Guinea, and whether that kind of came into it, especially with these like larger family kind of models and the caretaking that comes like with the biological and the non-biological children as well, and whether that kind of played any factor. And I'm not sure whether you looked at it like in the Bolivia case either.
So in the case of Equatorial Guinea, we didn't necessarily have much data coming from the field of who is the beneficiary in terms of the gender. I think it was more predominantly male population that participated in trainings, and women were taking care of the children, but this actually are the beneficiaries. These are the people. So I think it's a good mix. So I'm not quite sure how many participated in our surveys, but I definitely think that there could be this also gender implication in the actual implementation of the survey, so conducting the survey, because women wouldn't really go directly to men, so they would go as an intermediary. There has to be somebody to facilitate the discussion, so probably male to male surveys and women to women surveys were done a lot more often rather than women surveying men. And I think that was it pretty much in that sense. We didn't really look too much into it in the consultancy project. But in my own individual research case in Bolivia and in Armenia, I think the two really stuck with me in the first in the case of training these women how to become a proficient in computers, and the second case in Armenia, giving mobile phones to women. And in both cases, they mentioned that having access to information really reduces domestic violence. Because women have more access to information, and women have continuously will have more access to financial institutions, more access to basically independence from their spouses. So it really is reducing the domestic violence cases, because a lot of the times domestic violence cases are not reported and they are not really spoken about in the community. So if it is isolated, whatever stays in the community. And once there is more access to outside world, more or less, then these cases can be even not just reported to a police or anything, but at least spoken among in the community. So a woman can call up another woman, and then more informational exchanges happen here. And they are able to maybe escape or at least reduce the domestic violence cases. And that was really something that I never really thought about, and really came to me when I was reading in both cases. And one more thing that I wanted to mention in Armenia, when the case was done through Oxfam, the case study was done through Oxfam, they also mentioned that women were gaining more leadership roles in this sense, because it was targeted towards these rural associations, the local associations, the groups. So if, let's say 80% of them were male groups, there's at least this 20% that is a women-led group, and they come together and they become more united in their work nature, and they know, they have this knowledge exchange among each other. And the people that were actually leading these groups, the women that were leading these groups, obviously that was contributing to women in leadership roles as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nuna. This was really, really fascinating.
Thank you so much.
And it's really, it opens up like a very different understanding. I mean, it's listening also, like, and also kind of thinking about the social return on income idea. It's just fascinating to see that. And thank you all for attending. And I just wanted to remind you that this is an ongoing series, and next month actually we're bringing forward our next month's event to the beginning of April rather than the end of April. It's going to be on April 6th with, and there will be more information about it very soon, with our two alumni one from business, Elmira Agazan, and the other from EC, Gaane Arabalyan, who just published their children's book on important women, on women and the importance of women in our society, both historical and contemporary women. But we can continue the conversation with Nune and her questions on her reflection while sipping wine together and do that.
Thank you so much.